So basically, this is what I'm seeing: is that whenever a time jacker shows up to create another writer, they're essentially rewriting the timeline. That's why whenever Aura, or not Aura, but Ir, however you pronounce his name, jabs in the Rider Watch, he always says, "From now on, you'll be known as Kamen Rider," whatever. And basically, it rewrites history so that one, the writer that they become does not exist. Therefore, everything else is erased from them. We see this in Kamen Rider Wizard, the Wizard one, or at least the other half of the Wizard one, where he turns. I can't remember names all that well of the characters, but when he turns the person who will become Kamen Rider Wizard into another wizard, we see a flashback of, I think it was episode 2, episode 2 or 3 or 4, one of those episodes, Kamen Rider Wizard, where he's fighting a phantom, and we notice, it was Phoenix, he was fighting Phoenix, and we see not only him disappear, but we also see Phoenix disappear. And remember from Wizard's ending with Amadam, he's like, "Riders originate from the monsters, and I am both monster and rider now because I can steal your power," blah 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 blah. But basically, if you're getting rid of the common riders from the timeline in all total, you'd think, oh well, okay, so that just simply means that they're done. Does not necessarily mean that the villains are done. But it seems like, to me, seeing how Phoenix was erased or just disappeared, it could be a double-edged sword. It could be that, okay, so they've been removed from time, so they don't exist. Therefore, there's no reason for the bad guy to be there at that point in time. It makes sense. It's factual. But if that was the case, then the world would not exist in 2018. The Phantoms would have destroyed everything. The greed would have destroyed everything. You gotta remember that the events that make these guys Kamen Riders generally happen after the Kaijin are awakened or they start doing their shit. It's not, oh, he's a rider and then we get monsters. No, it's monsters first, riders second. So, and if that's the case, then it's really confusing with build, because there's technically 3 builds. You got the movie, which is part of the series, but with ZO has its own canon and timeline. Then you got the series itself, which is its own canon and timeline. Then you got Kamen Rider ZO's variation, which has its own canon and timeline. Technically, there's 4, because we have a new world that Sento created at the end of the series, which, of course, has its own timeline. Whew! But most of the events make sense, generally speaking. Generally speaking, I say, because there are still some inconsistencies. The first inconsistency, and pretty much a minute one, is that when we see the preview for Dan Kurto in episode 8, we see that he's using it looks like the dangerous zombie Gashet, even though technically they don't exist. Because the game virus doesn't exist. Because Kamen Rider X8 doesn't exist and never happened. So, technically, he shouldn't have that. Also, because it's the Down Foundation and not Gim Corporation, it's obvious that it does rewrite everything. So, even though, oh, well, this guy is gone, so Evolt probably chose somebody else, or whatever you may be thinking, it's just not possible. And especially seeing how in the New World, Evolt never existed. So, technically, Evolt was a precursor to what's going to happen to all the writers. Not only was he erased from existence, apparently he was also kind of technically erased from history, seeing how everyone was pretty much unaffected by, it was like, oh, well, this never happened. We never met you guys. What's good? But that aside, build aside. Right? Going to X8, it makes perfect sense. Everything is done. Bugsters don't exist. Gim Corporation doesn't exist. None of that happened. Tiger never met Nico. I don't know if Hero probably still met. I draw a blank at her name, but he probably still met her. Poppy sadly does not exist because Dan never lost his. I don't believe game illness is what took his mother away, so he probably never lost his mother. And he straight out, after gaining the power of Kamen Rider O's, killed his father. So there's there's that shit. Enji is not Kamen Rider O's anymore. That's obvious. Once Uro does that line, from now on you are blank, blank, blank. You become that rider. Essentially, you become another version of that rider, which warps time. It basically creates a paradox. These paradoxes can actually cancel out other paradoxes. The Kamen Rider Phi's, another rider, technically activates, but at the same time cancels out the whole Takumi's entire timeline. Especially considering how Gates has the Drive Wider Watch, which cancels out Drive's series as a whole. So Krim never died. There was no Roy Mudes. I'm not sure if Bono was still insane or not, but there could be some sort of interesting divide within that. Kiriko, the police force, special units, none of that stuff happened. And because of that, Kamen Rider Sango and Yongo never existed. If Sango never existed, then they didn't get their time alternation machine. And because of that, Kamen Rider 4 never happened. And because that never happened, Kamen Rider Phi's never became a paradox. So it makes sense for him to exist in 2018. And when they defeated the Forze Orpanox, it most likely gave Gintoku and no, not Gintoku. I'm getting their names all mixed up. But they most likely gave Ginshan and Ryu. I'm good with names, I swear. But it most likely gave Forze and Meteor back their memories for a brief amount of time. Just like it did with Kamen Rider Beast in Episode 8. When they defeat the Wizard in 2018, whoosh, and then he gets his memories back for a brief amount of time before technically falling back into, lackluster memory. Now, because he still has his Rider Watch and didn't hand it over, like everybody else just happily does, he does, I guess, retain some form of memory of what happens. I'm guessing. Because he does still transform into Kamen Rider Beast. He still has his powers. He wasn't completely wiped from history. Now, it is stated that, or supposed that, Beast got his powers before Haruto. And if that is the case, I don't know if it still makes sense. Because, remember, he has to feed Chimera. It's like a mirror monster. You have to feed them. Otherwise, they become unruly children and start to revolt against you. So I'm not sure if Phantoms still exist. Like, there's a lot of things that you gotta look like, I wonder, and then at the same time you're like, Because if Phantoms do still exist, that would mean White Wizard still exists. And if you remember, by the canon timeline of Kamen Rider Wizard, Beast does not, or is not strong enough to fully defeat Wiseman. And when he does defeat Wiseman or stop his plan, he loses his powers. And therefore he can't go on to fight him like Haruto does. So technically a lot of people in Haruto City should be dead. Like, there's a lot of things that are just like, they had to have erased the bad guys as well. Otherwise, nothing stopping Masamune from getting Kronos' powers and then just doing whatever the hell he wants. Nothing is stopping Evolt from literally eating the planet, and nothing is stopping anyone, if this is true. But because they haven't, the world isn't shit, it basically means that, yeah, the bad guys are getting erased too. It's the only logical reason. I just find it the only logical reason as to why there are just no one is just destroying every goddamn thing. Is that they're just like, because if you think about it, Another Rider is not the same as Decade's Another Rider world. Another Rider world, these guys were Another Riders. They were different people. And then there were also different people as the monsters and stuff going on like that. These guys are riders in appearance, but monsters at the core. Meaning that it's taking the whole riders and monsters share their powers thing literally. When they overlap the way they are doing it, where you look at another wizard or another Oz, and these things actually do generally look like demonic creatures of hell. I mean, do you remember when we first see Kamen Rider builds Another Rider? We got them eyes and mouth moved and shit. That was some creepy stuff. It's the only one that I think did that so far too. But you get what I'm saying. Is like these are truly monsters that look like the Riders, in the same vein that Riders get their powers from the same source as the monsters. So, therefore, it makes sense that if they're making Another Riders, it doesn't just get rid of the Rider, but also the monster, since it's both sides of the coin. Now, as for episode 9, when Dan has both Gim and O's Ride Watches, the Gim Ride Watch, I guess technically, candidly, makes a little bit of sense, but at the same time it doesn't. I mean, he could have been trying to make the Gim Corporation, maybe, but because he never made the Bugster disease and there was no Emu and there's no powder, then there's really no point for the Gim Ride Watch to exist, except for another time paradox. I mean, it's logically possible, because if you think about it, O's the debut time was 2010, and went back in time to 2010. Going back in time to 2010, and creating Kamen Rider O's as Another Rider out of Kyoto, basically says, okay, time to overwrite Kamen Rider O's, but at the same time, double override Kamen Rider X-Aid. This basically technically means that Kamen Rider Gim is removed from history. Because Gim is removed from history, they never met and fought O's, but that doesn't, not O's, but Ghost. But that doesn't matter because we already know Gates has the Ghost Ride Watch, so Ghost already has been erased from the timeline. Sorry, Takeru, but if you're dead this time, you stay dead. There's no magical bullshit to keep you alive. It's actually very, very disturbing when you think about it. Like, it's really morbid when you think about, like, he died to become a Kamen Rider. He might just be dead right now. I don't know what happened to that guy, but yeah, it's not good. But going back to the O's and Gim situation, it technically makes sense because he went back in time, farther back in time, I guess. So he just did that, and if this timeline is really just going in hard and coming out just as hard, it basically double overrides X-Aid so that Gim doesn't exist. So technically, nothing in X-Aid can possibly happen anymore, because everything has been effectively canceled out. You got both X-Aids done now. And not to mention that Kyoto would also later become a freaking Bugster, which is that season's Kaijin. So you got a lot of overriding right now. He also has fighting experience, so there's also why he makes a pretty excellent Kamen Rider, Another Rider monster. The issue is it still pretty much lines in with timeline consistency. But we're going all over the place, so it does make sense as to why it's a bit more confusing. It's just like how many people hated the whole, let's introduce time travel into Kingdom Hearts. Time travel makes things very confusing if you don't handle it properly. Like, you need to put in rules, but these rules need to be established from the get-go. Throwing it in at random points in time is sloppy to lazy writing and plot planning. Unless you have this idea already in, like, extreme foresight, which apparently Tezuya Nomura did have, then there's really no way to save your story once you introduce time travel. Like, it's sort of like the whole Rick and Morty thing. Like, they don't have time travel, but they do have dimension travel. Because dimensions are easier and more fun to play with. Time is not. Because there's a lot of consistency you have to add in. Alright. Now, going on the Kamen Rider O's. Eiji apparently is wearing a suit and stuff, and there is no underwear to be found anywhere. I'm pissed about that. But what I'm happy about is that he does have a little red feather there, so it's just like, aw, he has Ankh with him, even when he doesn't know Ankh exists. And unfortunately, because another O's exists, this erases the greed and the yummy, because they would have to have woken up before he met Ankh, received the belt, so on and so forth. It is possible that Ankh could have met another human, but that human would most likely die because they're not Inji. And because of that, they've most likely, sadly, laid waste. The greed was most likely laid waste to the entire planet by now, because there's a lot going on in Oza. To be honest with you, I don't know who did it. Probably Kazari, because he's an asshole. But there's a lot of development and planning with the characters that just does not happen. So they're just verbatim, which means the smartest, Kazari, most likely won the whole let me become real before my brothers and sisters. And Maki, Dr. Maki, just never happened because there's a reason why it's called the Dan Foundation. Because because another O's exists, and not only does it intertwine the Dan family, but it also kinda erases Kogami, which was the original foundation in Kamen Rider O's. They just killed Happy Birthday Man. And because they got rid of him, we also don't get to see Creepy Doll Man. So, yeah. I mean, Hina's a thing, Inji's a thing, but that's it. We will never see that beautiful secretary ever again, and we will probably never see the Birth Boys ever again, which is really sad, because I did like Date-san. Date-san. Date. But yeah, as we go further, I'm really trying to figure out how this is going to all overlap and coincide. Because one, even though Decade is a part of the main storyline, most of his adventures and actions happened in other worlds. Systematically, that would mean that Zio has just killed 9 other planets by erasing Decade. And also gotten rid of Decade's immortality because he's got that sort of... So long as just one person, Oretokes, that he is a passing through Kamen Rider, he will pass through forever. But if you erase him from history, you essentially erase the worlds he's visited, and erased pretty much everything about him. And of course you also erase DN because, I mean, if Decade never got his abilities, that means Shocker never made the Deca driver. That's basically it. If they didn't make that, why the hell would they make the DN driver? Especially seeing how that one's the easiest one to steal and take. No way that's going to happen. Just no way. Fun fact, though, this also sort of erases events in Sinkinger, because they had that crossover episode that never happened. And by extension, technically, I guess that sort of makes all the crossovers just non-existent. Guy never met Kikaider, what were the other ones? There were no Superhero Tyson crossover, little Super Sentai specials. None of that shit happened. In some cases, that's a relief. For me, at least. Some of those were just not really good. In other cases, it's kind of heartbreaking. Especially for that one, because that was the first one. But going through it all, some things really don't have too many big effects on things because they have their own timeline, so it's not too much. Like if Kuga goes away, then Agito is fucked in a sense. Agito not doesn't affect Kuga so much, but Agito is fucked because G3 is based off of Kuga, and if they do Kuga before Agito, then they basically have already erased G3 from existence. Which is just holy shit, because G3 is based off of Kuga. Just like Gattack, and for the most part, most Kuwagata themed or Stag Beetle themed riders are based off of Kamen Rider Kuga. Circumventing a lot of things. As for, I'm trying to think of other timeline importance. Kamen Rider Kiva gets fucked over because they were all about time. Same with pretty much. Oh, same with Den-O. God, what's gonna happen to Den-O? Jesus Christ, because there's no Ryotaro anymore. So, I'm not sure we're gonna get an Ore Sanju, and I'm pretty sure that line just never happens, ever does it? Because he doesn't exist, and really, you always have the alternative where they just pick somebody else. But who? Who? Canonically, it's only those people who can actually do the shit that they're supposed to do. Anyone else most likely would be killed, and you wanna know why? It's Kamen Rider. If you use any fucking sort of real world logic, you will die. The only time it's acceptable is if you're the main character, like Kamen Rider build. But generally speaking, there's really no way to save any timeline, really. Unless his super form allows him to... Because he is getting a super form. Unless his super form allows him to rip apart space and time and make it so that there's a separate timeline, there is no fucking way to save the Heisei and Neo-Heisei era. They are doomed to a life of inconsistencies. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic. I just kind of wanted to air this out. Because a lot of people are technically dead, or should be dead, and a lot of monsters are dead too, or at least they just did not... They just were so incompetent, they couldn't even do any goddamn thing. Like, it's a two-way street. Like, really, there's only two ways to look at this. Like, you're erasing them from history, so technically the Kaijin should have killed everybody. Like, if we were really serious, once you erase Kuga from history, no one else should have happened. At all. Because the Grangi would just keep killing people and killing people and killing people until there's no one left to kill. But those are generally my thoughts on this situation. Ciao.